and welcome to the Civic Society's latest event, A Conversation with Dale Vince. In case you don't know me, I'm Juliet Shipman, and I'm Chairman of Stroud Civic Society. And I'm very pleased to welcome Dale Vince, who must be very well known to most of you, particularly through his recent appearances on radio and TV. Tonight, his topic, amongst others, is solving the energy crisis, which I think is particularly relevant today and at this moment. Before we start, we will go over to David Jones for some technical information, and then to the main event, Dale Vince in conversation with Tim Mars.
Thank you, Juliet. So if I could remind people to leave their microphones on mute through the initial part of the discussions. There won't be any pictures on the screen this evening, but you will be able to ask questions at the end potentially. But we would like you to put questions in chat, please. Chat can be accessed through the menu. And if you put your question into chat as you go along, you'll both remember it, and then I can look through them and group similar questions together, and I'll read those out at the end. And then depending on time, we will then have questions from the audience for anything that hasn't been raised in chat. If there's any other questions that you're having technical problems or whatever, you could try messaging me in chat as well, and I'll try and sort you out. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Tim Mars, who will introduce the speaker and get the discussions underway. Thank you.
Hello, yes, I'm Tim Mars. I'm on the committee of Stroud Civic Society, and I'm very happy and pleased to have that Dale Vince accepted our invitation to come and speak tonight. In fact, most of the time when I turn on the radio, I don't have a television, which is one thing I have in common with Dale, probably not many things, but when every time I turn on the radio, I often hear Dale on, and so a lot of his views are well known, and I've actually retweeted and Facebooked some of his pronouncements. So really, because Dale knows far more about the subject and knows what he wants to say, so the first thing to ask Dale is, how do we get into this mess, and how do we get out of it?
Thank you, Tim, and thank you everybody for the invite. I'm really actually quite pleased to be here tonight. The invite and the topic was quite engaging for me. I think the energy crisis is probably, certainly for me, one of the most important things that we've got to wrestle with. It began in August last summer, and a series of events combined into a bit of a perfect storm. We had in Britain the lowest wind year for about 40 years. And we increasingly rely on wind for our electricity. About 40% of our electricity now in Britain comes from renewable energy, and most of that comes from the wind. So that created a shortfall. At the same time, our nuclear fleet, a bunch of those power stations didn't come out of scheduled maintenance at the end of the summer. That's not a 1 in 40-year event, that's a 1 in every 2 or 3 year event, but it caused a further shortage. Now we're connected to the continent by 2 cables undersea through which we bring power when we need it. One of those burnt down, creating a further shortage. In Britain, we have a chronic shortage of gas storage. We have 1% of Europe's gas storage for 10% of Europe's population. That created another problem. Our system turned to gas to fill the shortfall, using it to make electricity. At the same time, as the rest of the world turned to gas as well, and gas became in super short supply globally, and the price just went crazy. The government have been running a price cap for the last 3 years in which they control the retail price of energy, but not the wholesale price. So the wholesale price went through the roof while retail prices were kept down, and they bankrupted 28 energy firms since August last summer. Some of those were big companies, most of them were small companies, but in total, 4 million customers were stranded by the bankruptcy of their energy company, dumping a cost estimated to be about £4 billion onto the public. It remains to be seen if the government puts that back onto energy bills, which is what they normally do, or whether they take that and pay for it from central government funding. And that's an important part of what we'll talk about next, which is short-term solutions. So the energy crisis was caused by a perfect storm of events: low wind, low nuclear, burnt down interconnector, low storage of gas, high demand for gas globally. And we're utterly dependent on global markets for our fossil fuels and for fossil fuel pricing. And this is a really important point because nearly 50% of the gas that we use in Britain today comes from the North Sea. That's our North Sea. But we still paid 10 times more for it last month than we did the year before because it's pegged to global prices, and that can't be right. So when we come to talk about long-term solutions for this, which is based around green energy and energy independence, it's important that we not only make our own energy here, but we detach from global markets for price. So that's the roots of the energy crisis. Right now, there have been nearly 30 bankruptcies, 4 million stranded customers. The price cap is about to be reviewed in about 10 days' time. It will go up £600 or £700. It will take the average bill to about £2,000. That's a near 75% price rise. That's going to hit an awful lot of people awfully hard. The big question is, what is the government going to do about it? So go on, Tim.
What do you think the government should do about it, the short-term crisis that's going to hit when the price cap is lifted?
So there are some ideas being kicked around. One of them is the removal of VAT. It does seem wrong that we have VAT on energy bills. It is only 5%, not the full 20%. But we don't have, for example, VAT on food, which is another one of life's essentials. Taking VAT off energy bills will help, but it will only scratch the surface. In total, we pay £9 billion a year in tax on our energy bills. That's about £300 per household per year, which is about half of the price rise that's coming this April. And so the government have it within their hands to take that away. They're creating a large part of the problem of unaffordable energy bills with stealth taxes. They're often called green taxes, but that's a misdirection. There are 5 of them. 2 of them are for social programs, home insulation and the warm home discount. And 3 of them support green energy. And the total cost is £6 billion. VAT is worth £3 billion. So roughly 100 quid on VAT per household, 200 quid on government stealth taxes. Now, it's an anomaly in the energy market that we add the cost of these programs to the actual product itself, the cost of the product to the bills. We put £2.5 billion a year into farming. We give to farmers to help them make food cheaper. We don't add the cost of that back on to a checkout bill at the supermarket. We put £2 billion into the train operators. We don't add the cost of that to the cost of a train ticket. It would be perverse to do that. Those things come from central government funding. So the government could take a big step and normalize the situation, take taxes off of energy bills, but I don't think they will because it will create a £9 billion hole somewhere else in their revenues. The rather interesting idea being floated by some of the big new entrants like Octopus is for the government to create a £20 billion fund to lend money to energy companies to subsidize energy bills for the next 5 years. I think that's bonkers. I think that's an abdication of responsibility. If energy bills are too high and it needs subsidizing, the government should simply do it. There's another alternative that we've just announced or floated today, and that is to keep tax on energy bills, but to adjust it so that it works like income tax, where you have graded levels of tax. And for the first certain amount of income, for example, there's no tax. And then you have a lower rate of tax until ultimately you have the highest rate of tax. And that is progressive. The current tax on energy bills is regressive. It hits the hardest up among us the worst. And so we could simply realign tax on energy bills, keep the 9 billion in there, but push it to the higher end of earners and people that can afford it and free up the people in energy poverty. I think it's a good idea. We'll see what happens. But these are the short-term issues. How do we make energy more affordable? We've got to confront the reality that these are global prices. We can do nothing about that. Even when we make gas ourselves in the North Sea, we can do nothing about it. And I think that's crazy. The windfall tax is another idea. 20 billion has been made by North Sea operators this winter from these crazy high prices, 20 billion more than they normally would expect to have. A windfall tax could claw some or all of that back and use it to repair the damage in other parts of the economy.
I think one of the things that surprised me that was in your last podcast was that you said that the government subsidizes North Sea oil and gas production, by more than it gets back in tax, which seems extraordinary at a time when we're trying to wean ourselves off fossil fuels.
Yeah, I mean, we put at the last count something like £12 billion a year into subsidising fossil fuels. It's mad. It's still more money than we put into supporting renewable energy. And you know, this is at a time when we've got legally binding zero carbon targets. We've signed up to the Paris Accord and all those good things. We're still putting much more money into fossil fuels than we are into renewable energy. But the very idea that we put more in than we get back out is just crazy. You know, fossil fuels are basically uneconomic. That's what that's telling us. And so the sooner we leave them behind, the better.
And the other thing I think that was contained in your podcast was something that I hadn't heard of before. You were saying that one of the ways that the fossil fuel industry tries to say that they could reach net zero is they talk about carbon capture. And you said in the podcast that carbon capture is in fact a myth. It isn't yet possible.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing. The whole fossil fuel industry talks constantly about carbon capture as if it's real, as in it exists and it's economic and scalable, and you know, it actually works somewhere in the world, but it doesn't. And the fact that we put more money into the North Sea than we get back in the way of tax came out in a court case last week, Tim. That's where we got it from. And it's been put on the record by that court case. The activists that brought it against the government lost the case, but they won the point. And the judge put that on the record. The same judge ruled against them. He said, because the fossil fuel companies have available to them carbon capture and storage. And by that means, it's not incompatible to pursue the last dregs of fossil fuels from the North Sea and pursue zero carbon. And that's a fundamentally flawed judgment, because carbon capture does not exist anywhere in the world. And I don't think that it ever will. It can't be economic. When you look at the fundamental physics involved, it will never be economic.
Does China have a program of carbon capture? Because I know they're still building coal-fired power stations. Do they claim to have a carbon capture strategy?
You know, I think a lot of countries are kicking it around and putting some money into R&D, and quite often those programs are about being seen to do something. You know, our government's pretty good at that itself. China, in terms of renewable energy, is doing fantastically well. You know, it often is the whipping boy of the right wing in particular, saying, why should we, you know, do this, that, and the other to fight the climate crisis when China's building coal-fired power stations and all that kind of stuff. But if you look at the rate of their renewable energy building, it's phenomenal. It puts us to shame. And bear in mind that just about all of the world's solar panel production is in China. They make the stuff that we install to green ourselves up with as well. Electric buses as well that are hitting the roads now are coming from China. They're doing some good things. They're not doing all good things, and they do need to stop the use of coal, but so do we. Our own government is planning to allow a new coal mine to open in Cumbria. I can't believe that. You know, I mean, we hosted COP this year, and Boris Johnson berated the world's leaders for the gulf between words and actions. He said it wasn't good enough to say one thing and do another. And this is the Prime Minister that's allowing a new coal mine, the first one in 30 years, a third runway at Heathrow, and pumping billions into the North Sea by way of subsidies to chase yet more fossil fuels out of the ground, and spending something like 26 billion on a road building program, and not to mention the 100 billion on HS2, you know. Huge gulf between the words and deeds of our Prime Minister and our government.
HS2, yes, now renamed presumably the London to Birmingham Fast Railway. It doesn't look as though it's going to go any further.
Yes.
And that was another thing that Boris Johnson, I think, said that he would lie. I think as well as the Heathrow runway, he was going to lie down in front of the bulldozers against that. So
yeah, and he flew to Tim. He flew to Afghanistan to avoid the vote.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, he was foreign secretary at the time, and he made his one and only trip to Afghanistan randomly for no particular reason, and just wasn't in the house to be able to vote. Madness.
Yeah. So what would be those are some of the short-term fix. So the long-term really is we need to get out of the global market, or being tied to the global market, and basically establish our own energy independence. So we're not dependent on Russia and does France supply some of our electricity too from their nuclear plants? Is it a two-way interconnect? I think one of the ones that burnt out.
Yeah, they're both two-way interconnects, and we do use it to balance ourselves. And interconnectors are a good idea. You know, they're increasingly happening across Europe. And it's a great way for us to all reach 100% renewable energy powered as well, because the weather moves in broad fronts. And so it can be very windy in one part of Europe and not somewhere else. And so we can balance that with interconnectors. So the answer is for us to be energy independent. It's to make our own electricity and gas here in Britain, but we've got to be price independent as well. We've got to break the link to the global fossil fuel markets that set the prices. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, these markets set the prices, and the markets are rigged anyway, openly by OPEC, who control supply in order to put the price where they want it. But we have to break that link. When it comes to 100% green electricity, we have enough wind and sun to power the whole country 20 times over. We have the technology that we need. It's already the cheapest form of new energy that we can build, and it has been for about 10 years, and it's still getting cheaper, and it doesn't go up in price. So if we get it right, we can make all of our electricity here, and we can have energy bills that never go up, and we can solve the fuel poverty problem at the same time. Gas has been a much thornier issue, and for a lot of my time in the energy world, I thought we had to just give gas up, but we didn't have the answer to that in the way that we do with green electricity. But around about 2010, we discovered green gas was a thing, and we brought some to Britain for the first time. And then we went looking for a new way to make it. The traditional way was energy crops and food waste, and they both have environment problems. We found a third way, which is grass. We're just building Britain's first grass-fed green gas project in Reading. It'll be operational hopefully by this time next year, making enough gas for about 4,000 homes. And it's a brilliant opportunity for our country. We've crunched the numbers. There's enough land to grow enough grass to make enough gas for all of Britain's homes. We can create 100,000 jobs in the rural economy. We can save the import and burning of £7 billion worth of gas every year. And we can create a massive boost to biodiversity through the use of the fields in this very different way. And the government plan to decarbonize heating of our homes, which is the way it's often described, it's about how we stop using fossil fuel gas, is to have instead a national heat pump program. It's fraught with problems. We've calculated that it will cost about £300 billion to achieve this. And we could do green gas for about £30 billion, 1/10 of the cost. And I don't know if you want to talk about heat pumps, but there are a lot of problems with them. We need an awful lot more electricity to run them. You have to change your radiators, throw away your gas boiler, and probably end up with a house that's not as well heated as you're used to, unless you also make your house energy efficient, which we have to do anyway. So that shouldn't be a problem, but it isn't happening. Anyway, the heat pump program is a terribly misconceived thing. The government has thrown no money towards it at all, so it isn't even starting, but it's their big concept. Let's give up fossil gas and all have a heat pump. It costs about £8,000 per house to install. They'll add £500 a year to your electricity bill because you use an awful lot more electricity in the process, and you've got to change your radiators because the heat that they make is much lower temperature than what a gas boiler makes. But if we simply replace the gas in our mains with gas from grass, we can carry on as we are with our gas boilers and our radiators and all of them other benefits from a new industry, really creating 100,000 jobs in the rural economy and giving farmers a transition as well away from animal production, which they badly need.
Yes, so that solves by using the pasture land for grass rather than to feed cows, basically also removes the cow methane problem, which everyone laughs about so much. And obviously it's an attractive. I think you launched with, I believe it was the Daily Express, a Save Our Boilers campaign, which is about this very much, that stopping the government's insanely expensive proposal that everyone should have heat pumps, which, as you say, particularly in existing houses where it's not possible to site them ideally, often work extremely badly. So I've heard reports of some people who've had good experiences with heat pumps, others who've said it's a complete disaster. Obviously, if you're building a brand new purpose-built house, you can actually entirely engineer the house to work with heat pumps and say have underfloor heating rather than radiators. But it does look it looks like an awfully expensive way of scrapping what is effectively a technologically very sophisticated system. And I watched over the last 30 years, I watched boilers come on by leaps and bounds, to the current sort of condensing combi boiler that almost everyone has. And it does seem extraordinary then to throw all that away and put everything into electricity.
Yeah, all of that is true. And the really interesting thing about heat pumps, which I think is worth sharing, is that basically it's like a fridge but running in reverse. So instead of bringing the cold into a fridge, it brings the warm into your house, and it does that by chilling the air outside. And so a heat pump is at its maximum efficiency in the summer when the air outside is warm. And in the winter, when you need the heat the most, it's at its minimum efficiency. You get something called a coefficient of performance, which in the winter will be 1, meaning you put in 1 unit of electricity to get out 1 unit of heat. In the summer, you get 4. And the people that support heat pumps always talk about the 4, but they don't talk about what happens in the winter when we all need heat the most. Gas demand can go up 8-fold in the winter because of our need for heat. That will create a massive spike in electricity demand if we're all using heat pumps running 1 for 1. Because a typical UK household uses 3,000 units of electricity a year and 12,000 units of gas. And for that reason, we'd need 4 or 5 times more windmills and solar panels to power the country 100% if we use heat pumps instead of green gas.
What about ground source heat pumps? Obviously, they're more expensive to install. Do they have a better record in terms of efficiency? Are they a better prospect with new buildings?
Yeah, they are. They're probably the best. I've got one myself, and the temperature of the ground is basically more stable. It fluctuates less between summer and winter, and so you get a more consistent coefficient of performance and a higher one as well, actually. But you need a big area of land. It's quite an expensive installation, and it's only ever going to be a niche solution for that reason. So when the government talks about heat pumps, they mean an air source heat pump, which is like a little air conditioning box that you can stick out the side of your house and makes a bit of noise, but it just sucks the air in, takes the heat out and spits the air back out. It's the least effective form of heat pump, but there are also waterborne ones as well.
But obviously, if you're living in a terraced house, you can't exactly go for a ground source heat pump or a water source heat pump for that matter. So it would be, so that's why the least efficient heat pump is the one that is being promoted.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
But would it be a good idea, for instance, in terms of boilers, would it still be a good idea to build new properties with boilers? This is assuming green gas comes on and becomes a viable fuel. Or would it still be better just to keep boilers to existing houses and mandate that all new houses should have some sort of alternative fuel, electric based, whether it's ground source, water sourced, or air source, or would
good question.
Boilers should stay in new houses as well?
That's a good question, Tim. And up until about 5 years ago, we had a zero carbon code for house building. It was about to become live for all new house builds, and they had to be zero carbon by design. So they had very high levels of energy efficiency, and they had to basically make their own energy, which effectively takes them off the grid. David Cameron scrapped that despite it having been a program 10 years in the development with the support of the building industry. That kind of approach would make great sense. And there's no room for a gas boiler in that for sure. It would be done by heat pumps, solar panels, windmills, high levels of insulation. So I would go further than what you're suggesting. Don't just exclude the heat pump, but get back to the zero carbon code for sustainable new homes.
Which would still give the option for boilers, or would it still say that it has to be?
I don't think it would. No, I don't think it would. No.
It wouldn't.
No.
So new houses would not have gas effectively.
Yeah, that's right. And look, we build about 150,000, maybe 200,000 new homes a year, and there are 30 million homes in the UK. So it's the tip of the iceberg in many respects in terms of the problem. We can change how we build new homes, but the retrofit of the existing 30 million is the big problem.
So what role do you think insulation has? I mean, there are people sticking themselves to roads and various other objects around the country who have been, and sometimes being removed by irate motorists. Insulation, better insulation of our existing stock has been virtually a mantra for the last 30 or 40 years, as I recall. Is that still the most important thing we should be doing?
Yeah. So the most cost-effective way to save energy is insulation. The most cost-effective way to reduce carbon is insulation. It isn't to make renewable energy and pour it into a leaky bucket. It's to plug the holes in the bucket. And that's been the case for decades. It's so obvious and so badly needs doing, and will improve the quality of life for people as well, because people are living in drafty, damp homes as a result of poor insulation and can't afford the bills to heat them. So it's super important that we do that. That's step one, that is. insulate our homes properly, and then power them with renewable energy. That's the right approach.
But isn't there some evidence that some people who have that home insulation installed, whether it's done as part of a grant scheme or they pay for themselves, merely decide to live at a much higher temperature? I believe that the average temperatures have moved back over the years from something like 14 degrees in the medieval period. We're now up to sort of 20, 21 degrees indoors. I've got a little meter from Help the Aged in Herefordshire, oddly, that I picked up there, which tells me at the moment this room is too small and I'm too cold, and I'm at the risk of dying of respiratory distress. Yet the room is at 15 degrees.
Okay, yeah, that seems a bit extreme as a warning. I mean, it makes sense that temperatures will go up. If you have better insulation, then, you know, you're going to get a better temperature outcome in your house. I think that's normal. Whether that's being overdone to, you know, overcompensate for the energy that's being saved, honestly, I don't know. I haven't seen any data that suggests that, but it's one of the outcomes you would expect. You plug the leaks in a house and it gets warmer.
One of the things that you mentioned was mentioned again in a recent Zero Carbonist thing was the what the build-up of Russian troops at the edge of Ukraine, what might happen to the supplies of gas from Russia if there were to be sanctions. So do you think there is a risk there that we may be in even worse trouble, that this will be just the Vicarage Tea Party in comparison if Russia chooses to cut off gas to Europe, or are they so dependent on the revenue from that they're unlikely to do so?
It's a really interesting situation because in the first few months of the energy crisis, the Russians were blamed for being part of the problem, for having turned down the tap into Europe. But it turns out that they hadn't done that at all, that actually they were delivering all of their contractual commitments for volumes of gas. And Putin said something really interesting. He said he had suggested to the West that they have long-term contracts for gas a decade ago. But we decided to move away from it in favor of the spot market. And it's the spot market right now that's killing us. So I think he made a good point. You know, it's our focus to the dogma of free markets and capitalism that's put us in this spot. It's ironic to be told that by Putin. If there's a conflict in Ukraine, I think it's absolutely clear that we won't go in militarily. There will be enormous application of sanctions on Russia, and they already suffer quite a lot of sanctions. I'm surprised they still supply Europe with gas at all, but I've got no doubt in my mind that the response from Russia will be to turn off the gas supply to Europe. Why wouldn't you? It's probably the one lever that they've got in response to sanctions that are bound to come their way.
One of the things I think we mentioned before everyone else came up on air, though, was that an issue was raised as that why standing charges seem to be increasing so much on bills when it's that should surely not have been affected by the rise in the cost of gas. Why are standing charges being increased as well as the unit cost? Yeah,
and I think something like 30% of a typical bill is the use of the use of the national and local distribution networks to get the power and gas to your home. And they're owned by different companies. They're typically owned by foreign pension funds. They're regulated by the regulator, Ofgem, but not in the same way that energy suppliers are. So the price cap allows energy suppliers to make a 2% margin. It's an unheard of low level of margin in any business sector in our economy, completely unheard of. And especially for a business as volatile as energy is. The distribution companies, on the other hand, are making profits closer to 30%, and they're regulated. So I don't understand how that happens, but it's one of the great contradictions and anomalies of the energy market. And so, you know, one of the good things to come out of this energy crisis, hopefully, will be a big reset in the way things are done.
Well, you mentioned the idea of graduated energy bills on an income tax system, but I remember in the late 1980, I think, when I was living in London, that there was a standing charge rebate for low users, which I qualified for.
Yeah, that's one way to deal with the problem. A simple per unit standing charge could also work, you know, but the fixed rate of however much it is per day is a blunt instrument. But I think hopefully it all gets swept up in the same review of the energy market. We can't be sure that it will, but the energy system is chock full of anomalies and things that don't quite work. And for people at the super low end of consumption like you, and for people at the super high end of consumption, is a very different outcome.
Yes, because when you buy a petrol for a car, effectively, that's one way by which people can be taxed for having cars that are less efficient. So effectively, it works very well, but you don't pay a separate charge for the cost of supplying the petrol station with the fuel. So it does seem odd when I look at a bill that there's almost no way I can make savings, because unless I could find a supplier that would either have no standing charge, but very high energy cost, or at least a very low standing charge, and then much higher energy costs. But there doesn't seem to be that tariff on the market.
No, the real problem, I guess, Tim, is that the distribution companies have a different way of charging to the energy companies, and energy companies try to pass through those costs from distribution companies, but they're coming at them on a different basis to how they charge customers, and they try to blend that for the different use cases. So one regulatory outcome could be that distribution companies are made to charge on a per unit basis. That would pass through to energy companies on a per unit basis, and they could pass it on to customers on the same per unit basis. That would be a neat answer.
So then you would just be paying effectively for the energy you use, which would also be an incentive to use less of it, either through your house or living at a lower temperature.
That's right. And if we apply the taxes on energy bills in that banded way that income tax is applied, we further incentivize people to use less energy, because as you use more, you'll progressively pay more for it per unit.
Yep. Okay, so if you were the energy minister now, I think you've laid it out fairly clearly, but what would be your immediate moves, and what would be your long-term policies if you came in with the incoming, whatever shade of stripe it is, government?
I would redistribute the tax burden on energy bills to ease the burden at the lower end of income and increase it at the higher end where it can be afforded. And by the way, it's also in accordance with a more fair way to impose a carbon tax, or the cost of getting to net zero, because 10% of people in the world and in our country, the wealthiest people, are responsible for 50% of all carbon emissions. It doesn't make sense that they're taxed for that in the same way that people on very low incomes, whose carbon budget anyway is already very small. So it would be a natural, logical thing to do that would help us to target the big carbon budgets that are being produced by the people that have the big actual cash budgets and can afford to pay for it anyway. So I would do that. And if that was not enough, would that be enough? I think that would be enough, actually, because we'd take the burden from people that can't afford it and give it to the people that can. But if that wasn't enough, then I'd look to subsidize for a year or two from the public purse, as we have done in the pandemic. We've spent 400 billion now in 2 years to support people, jobs, pubs, you name it, through the pandemic. Let's support energy bill payers for a year or two if we have to. Those are short-term things. Medium term, I would hope, not long term, because I think we can do it in 10 years. We could get to 100% green electricity on the grid, and we could get to 100% green gas if we just go for it. Stop the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. What I would do is, over a period of 5 years, I would progressively swap the fossil fuel money into the renewable energy pot, so that within 5 years, there was nothing going to fossil fuels and everything was going into renewable energy. We'd have about a 20 billion pot by then for renewable energy. And that way, we could help fund this 10-year program of conversion away from fossil fuels and the pricing of fossil fuels, and be an energy independent country with new industries, new jobs, and fighting the climate change would be a very happy piece of icing on the cake.
What do you think of the Labour Party's proposals?
I think they're good. I think it's something like 28 billion a year to spend on the green economy, which is more or less the right sum to be paid for by a change, ending the loopholes basically in the tax system, which are worth hundreds of billions to our economy. We lose hundreds of billions, and ultra rich people gain that way. Rachel Reeves said that at the Labour Party conference end of last summer, I think. I think they make great sense. And, I just think we're going to get a better outcome if we have a Labour government next time. I certainly hope that we do, because nothing has been right climate-wise about this government doing one thing, saying another. Never mind the way they've handled the pandemic and the whole Partygate thing, which is, just a disastrous sideshow, really, when the country needs leadership.
One thing that has come up over the years, but again keeps seem to being knocked back, and I don't know if you think it's somewhere to go. There's the idea of tidal power, say a Severn barrage, mentioned several times. And at one point, it looked as though there was going to be backing for a Swansea tidal lagoon, and that doesn't seem to have happened either. What's your views on tidal power and tidal lagoons?
Well, my view on the tidal barrage for the Severn is that I think there's a trade-off, a wildlife trade-off. To have it, we could get maybe approaching 10% of the electricity we need from that one project. And if it was government funded rather than privately funded, we could use it to end fuel poverty. It would make great sense. At the moment, we chuck huge sums of money every year into fuel poverty, but bills keep going up. And so every year we need to chuck more money in. If we gave fuel to the fuel poor, we could end fuel poverty that way with the project. And we made some calculations around that about 10 years ago. There would be a wildlife trade-off, absolutely. It would change the environment upstream, but not necessarily in a bad way. And the world has been changing, ever since there's been a world. Personally, I would accept that. The Swansea Tidal Lagoon was a very poorly conceived project. It was borrowed IP from the original idea, which is an offshore lagoon, which is a compound of water. Think of it as a square of rock wall, impounding an amount of water on the high tide. And when the tide drops, you let the water out through turbines and you make electricity. The guy behind Swansea worked with those guys and then split off. And in order to get around patents, he came up with the idea of attaching it to the shore. But it's fundamentally flawed because when you do that, you halve the volume of water in your impound, your rock wall, because you've got a sloping seabed up to the shore instead of a deep seabed. And that's what drove the economics to the point of stupidity, and the government wouldn't back it. So I think offshore tidal lagoons have a role, absolutely, and we're hoping to get involved in some of that in the not very distant future. It's also a way to control renewable energy. We can use it as a vast battery because we can choose when to release the water within a certain number of hours, which with other forms of renewable energy, you don't have that control. So it's a kind of hybrid between an energy generating project and a storage project, which I think is a good thing.
I seem to remember some years ago, didn't Ecotricity buy some sort of water turbine that sat on the bottom of the sea and had an electrical connector to the shore, or some sort of power connector? I think did you buy the patents to that or buy the rights to that?
We did. We invested in a company called Sea Razor, and it wasn't a turbine. It was a really novel idea. It was basically a device that was suspended underwater, anchored to the seabed. And if you can imagine like a piston and a piston rod coming out the top, the piston itself was afloat and it floated on the top of the sea. And as the waves went up and down, the piston went up and down and created a flow of air or a flow of hydraulic fluid in the body underneath the water. And the idea was to use that to create electricity. So a very simple device compared to an undersea turbine, but we couldn't make the economics work.
Right. So do you think there will be, you say you're interested in these offshore lagoons and you hope to be involved in something. What about a tidal barrage? Do you think there's a future, say, for a tidal barrage on the Severn, which I think has the highest or the second highest sea level changes in Europe?
In the world. I think it's the second highest tidal range in the world. There's a place in Canada that has a bigger one. And there's some really interesting new ideas around a Severn barrage as well. New, basically old turbine technology, much cheaper to make and stuff like that. I think the whole thing needs another look at, actually, because there's a big potential to do something.
I have seen proposals for, instead of like a sort of big physical barrier across some point in the Severn estuary, of actually sort of, in a sense, lagoons sort of along the way, which would also interfere less with the marine ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think I've come to the end of any questions to put to you. Is there anything else you'd like to say, or should we ask David to tell us what's come up in the chat room so far?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to go to questions now. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dale. That was fascinating and covered quite a wide range of topics. And to be honest, our audience have been typing away merrily as well. So we've got about
excellent
20 or more questions. I've grouped them into topics. Let's just start on the idea of an income-based tax on fuel. When the poll tax came in, I thought, oh, that's great, because I was a single person living in a large house. But of course that disappeared, and they've been talking about having income-based local taxes for a long time and not got anywhere. How do you believe that would work in practice? Because you're looking at two separate aspects, really, aren't you?
I may have not described it well enough by the sounds of the question. So the idea is to use the principle of income tax, where we have banded rates of tax. And so the bottom end is that your first £15,000 of income is tax-free. And then your next 15,000, you might pay 30% on. I'm not really sure. I'm not an expert on tax. And then
20.
if you earn more than 20, and then if you earn more than £50,000, you pay some more tax. And if you earn over £100,000 or something like that, you pay the top rate of tax, which is even more. The idea is to do the same with energy consumption. So let's say your first 3,000 units are tax-free. The next 2,000 have some tax. The next 5,000 have more tax, and anything over the top threshold has the top rate of tax. And so you take that 9 billion of tax that's here at the moment, distributed across the whole of consumption, and you push it up to the top end, and you leave the bottom quarter or the bottom third or whatever it is you need to solve energy poverty, you leave it tax-free.
Okay, I see what you mean now. And presumably that would apply to other fuels as well as electricity. So it applied to oil, for example. You haven't mentioned oil at all, but a lot of the villages around here obviously don't have gas, mains gas, and thus rely on either, at the moment, electric storage heaters or gas type installations, or oil mainly. So that would be, instead of the VAT element on each of those fuels, which is currently 5%, you'd somehow factor it in.
Yeah, and it's not just the VAT, you know, there's 9 billion in total of tax on electricity bills. There's not so very much on gas bills, but we could spread this burden across both fuels, and we could spread it across oil as well. I mean, I think the government are about to end the red diesel subsidy for farmers, for example, which is really interesting. It's been super cheap to have red diesel for many years now. So we could spread this tax burden across multi-fuels. I understand that, you know, some people are not on the gas main. I think it might be 10 or 15% of the country are not on the gas main, and people are using oil or electricity for that. We've got to get off oil. But the good news about the green gas program is that we can make that available to people that are not on the gas main, because we can liquefy it and pump it and carry it around in tankers like Gas does. And we could supply it to remote homes with an underground or overground gas tank. So there is an answer for people that are on oil right now.
Okay. There's quite a number of points come in about improving energy efficiency of the existing housing stock. Improving energy efficiency, especially in our homes, is one response to the crisis. Successive governments have failed to get a grip with the problem. To put it simply, we must insulate Britain. Much easier said than done, however. Retrofitting, insulating older properties can be complicated and expensive. Most people are familiar with approaches from small companies offering to install various sorts of insulation, frequently without very uncertain results. Older houses should be improved comprehensively by professional teams and the results properly certified. At present, building a new home is zero rated in VAT terms, while improving an older property attracts a 20% rate. If this was reversed, it might stimulate progress on meeting zero carbon goals at a stroke. The green home grants, personally, I was about to apply for cavity wall insulation and it suddenly disappeared last year, deemed a failure because I believe it wasn't being used. The renewable heat incentive is now being phased out in March, and the new one-off grant coming in, which is £5,000 for heat pump installation. The funding of 450 million is expected to install 90,000 heat pumps over 3 years, which is far fewer than the target of 600,000 a year announced in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan last November. So presently the government are just tinkering all the time. They announced the zero carbon, as you mentioned earlier, which would start in 2016. They announced that in 2013 and took it away. They keep putting in things and then taking them away. There was just no incentive at the moment to insulate, is there?
Yeah, I mean, all of that stuff is right. All of the points made there. I think I said myself that the government's actual commitment to the heat pump program itself is absurdly small, even though the program itself is misguided. The Green Bank or whatever it was called scheme had £1 billion available for people to green their homes up, and I think they managed to spend 100 million. It was terribly bureaucratic. That was outsourced to a foreign company, which might help explain why it was so badly landed. But within that statement of points that are all correct, there's another thing that's worth talking about, and that's the use of the tax system to encourage the right kinds of behavior and discourage the wrong kinds of behavior. So at the moment, there is VAT on home improvement products, and there shouldn't be, because they reduce energy bills, they reduce carbon, and that's our national goal. There is VAT, for example, on solar panels. It can be up to 20% if you want to power your house that way. But if you want to burn coal, you'll pay 5% VAT. That's an anomaly that we need to end. There's a carbon tax on green energy right now that we pay as a company, Ecotricity. We pay several £million a year for the green energy we make that makes no carbon. And large industrial users of electricity are exempt from this tax. So that makes no sense either. The government should. We had a campaign with the Daily Express last year, another campaign called Zero for Zero. And we called on the Chancellor to zero rate for VAT everything that helps us get to zero carbon. Energy efficiency products, renewable energy products, that kind of stuff. It's the most sensible thing to do. We shouldn't be taxing people that are trying to do the right thing and the thing that we have to do. What we should be doing, if we need that tax revenue, is putting it somewhere else, taxing the bad behaviors.
Yeah. We didn't talk much about gas boilers in homes. They're going to be banned in new houses after 2025. But even in existing properties where boilers are replaced, they're supposed to be being installed as hydrogen compatible. Now, you haven't spoken about hydrogen at all, either for a replacement gas in the gas supply system or for cars. And I was reading an article in Autocar only today that most car manufacturers have now abandoned their hydrogen car development programs because they're just not feasible. Last year in the UK, I think it was 12 hydrogen cars were sold, 2 Toyotas and 10 Hyundais. And there were only 14 hydrogen filling stations. So is changing to hydrogen in the gas system feasible?
So hydrogen cars have always been a stupid idea. The round trip efficiency of making hydrogen from electricity and then converting it back into electricity to run a hydrogen car, because that's what it is, an electric car with a hydrogen battery, is less than 50%. So you have to spend twice as much energy to do a mile in a hydrogen car as you do in a proper electric car charged from the mains. And so it makes our job twice as hard if we're trying to decarbonize. So it never made sense. And those were the fundamental physics, the problem that the manufacturers didn't overcome. Hydrogen in the gas grid makes more sense, but only to a degree, not 100%. That makes no sense. So what will surprise a lot of people to know is that all new gas boilers since 1997 in our country have been hydrogen compliant, capable. They're able to burn 20% hydrogen. This is really important because when we look to get to 100% renewable electricity on the grid, to achieve that and to minimize the times of not having enough power, along with energy storage, what we have to do is oversize the generation fleet so that we're generating more at times of low wind and low sun. When we do that, we'll create times of overgeneration. We'll have an excess. We can turn that excess into hydrogen, and we can store it, and we can turn it back into electricity when we need it. That's a good form of storage. Or we can put it into the gas grid, and we can augment green gas from grass with hydrogen from excess green electricity. So it's a really interesting piece of the puzzle about how we get to 100% renewables.
Thank you. Now about your grass and everything. So there's several comments about growing things. isn't effective carbon capture called photosynthesis, which is now 20 to 25% higher than it used to be, according to NASA and NOAA satellite studies. Good grass yields depend on fertilizer or manure. Fertilizer generally comes from fossil fuels, and if there aren't animals, where will the manure come from? How would grass growth be encouraged without animal waste to fertilize the ground? Continual removal of mowings weakens growth. Of course, we are animals and our waste could be used as fertilizer, which I believe it is in some places.
Yeah, it is.
And you also, just add into that, someone said, can coppicing woodland have a part to play? You didn't mention at all wood chip and its potential contribution to the scenario.
All right, I'll start with grass and I'll come back to wood chip. If I forget, remind me at the end of the grass piece,
Okay.
please. So our green gas mills, as we call them, are basically an industrial version of a cow's stomach. They take in grass and they break it down in the absence of oxygen. It's called anaerobic digestion. It's a very old technology, not as old as cows, but we've been able to do it for a long time. Now in a cow, the methane that's created this way escapes out of both ends. This is the big climate problem of cattle grazing. In our case, we collect the methane, scrub it up and put it into the grid. It's our product, not our byproduct. But our byproduct is the same as a cow. The other thing that comes out the back end of a cow is slurry, animal manure. What we're left with from our green gas mill, our industrial cow's stomach, is fertilizer. So the answer to how we fertilize the grass is we put our fertilizer back on the grass that we took it from. Bish bosh. It's an industrial version of a cow.
Good.
Wood chips. Now, really interesting wood chips. I'm about to write an op-ed for the Express this week, actually, about Drax. I don't know if anybody's heard of Drax. Sounds like a Bond villain, but it's not. It's an eco-villain. In fact, big coal-fired power station back in the day. They've converted 6 of their massive furnaces to burn wood chips instead of coal. And they're bringing the wood chips across from America, where often it's pristine forests, great habitats for nature. The carbon cost is absorbed in the USA's carbon budget. So it travels across the Atlantic, allegedly at 0 carbon, and then it gets burned. 60% of the heat generated in the burning is dumped into the atmosphere and into the local rivers, which is a problem. And it produces 10% of all of the particulate emissions of our country, the equivalent, sorry, of 10% of all of our cars. So that's the same as 3 million cars. So it's a massive polluter and a massive destructor of wildlife on the other side of the Atlantic. And it's greenwashing, basically. It's presented as green electricity. The government chucks enormous sums of money at it. Last year, it had £800 million in subsidies from the government, and in fact, from our energy bills. So it's massively expensive, massively polluting, and completely not 0 carbon. And I think it's a real problem. So I don't believe in biomass myself. Burning anything to make electricity doesn't make sense. That's what we have to stop doing. That's the steam age, and we have to stop it.
Just on that point then, what if we move on to Gloucestershire's new incinerator? Is that good?
God, no. I mean, no. What can we say about it? Everybody knows this, I think. It's the worst form of incineration, mass burn. There are so many better technologies out there. If it was going to be done properly, I mean, everything is wrong about the tender process, the secrecy. I mean, the whole process looks corrupt, and we're landed with a toxic problem now for the next 20 years or something. I don't know.
Okay, we've talked a lot about what happens in Britain. Our government seemed to have failed to produce a coherent fuel policy for years now. Does any country have sensible long-term policies? And for example, Norway is heavily into electric cars. I think they very much outnumber petrol cars sold now. And certainly other countries have much larger electric car grants. Ours is now down to £1,500 on cars under 32,000, whereas I think France and Germany are still giving about £9,000 as grants for electric cars. Obviously, grants for electric cars can't continue forever, And the other problem there is the fuel tax that petrol brings in is hardly used on the roads anyway. But so going back, what about other countries? Are there other countries that do well in terms of long-term energy?
Norway's an interesting example. It's a small, rich country. It doesn't have a very big car fleet at all. And through the use of their tax system, they have converted a large part of that to electric vehicles. It looks good. But Norway's wealth comes from fossil fuels. And when they count their own carbon budget as a country, they do not count the fossil fuels they produce and export to the rest of the world, which I think is wrong. I think policies in Europe are probably amongst the most progressive in the world. And I think in the US, if Biden can get his stuff through Congress, then they'll run a close second, or maybe even, you know, neck and neck with Europe. But I would say Europe and the US are probably global leaders. China is doing an awful lot, but of course they're still building coal-fired power stations as well. But that's to a degree a developing economy. You know, it's a country of over 1 billion people that are coming up the development curve, and you can kind of understand why they're doing some of what they're doing. But on the other side, on renewable energy, they're doing a massive amount.
Okay, thank you. Should we have a few more, Tim?
I think yes, indeed.
Yes. There's several sort of peripheral comments now. People very rarely discuss the energy used for cooking. Does anyone know what proportion of the average domestic energy budget it amounts to? I suppose it depends on what sort of cooking you do, really.
Yeah.
Pensions rely on the big oil companies' profits. How can this be managed if we transfer to grass, etc.? Well, I presume the pension companies will just switch their investments to appropriate funds.
Yeah, and that's beginning to happen, isn't it? The divestment away from fossil fuel companies is happening. A lot of the world's biggest pension funds have announced, you know, multi-billion-dollar shifts away from fossil fuels, which is a good thing. I think it was led by the public sector, actually. Certainly here in Britain, it was a number of years ago, taking responsibility for where the pension money goes, which, you know, is right, because how can you make a living out of something that's basically killing the planet for future generations? There's something pretty unethical about that as a pensioner.
Another thing you haven't talked about much at all is storage of electricity for obviously coping with peak periods when either you don't have wind or you don't have sun or whatever. Batteries or potentially other ways of storing electricity, like the pumped storage system at Trasfynydd. Battery costs hopefully are coming down dramatically still. Is long-term, do you see every house having their own battery packs to cater for fluctuations in demand? Even electric cars?
But there's a case for that, actually, but I'll just start at the big picture. I mean, battery costs are falling really fast, driven by the rise of the electric car, which itself was driven by the rise of the mobile phone, funnily enough, in terms of technology. We're building a 1 megawatt or 1.5 megawatt battery project at Berkeley this year. That will be our first battery project. We've got a software platform for controlling that and doing something new as well, which is controlling demand from big industrial users that can drop demand at certain times of the day. So the flip side of having storage that you can use to take electricity from at times of high demand is to reduce demand at times of high demand. And this combination is what we call the smart grid. There are several different forms of battery. The lithium ion is the one we know best, but there are chemical flow batteries. There are supercapacitor batteries, all kinds of stuff coming along. Graphene is being touted as an amazing material for batteries. I think we'll see a lot happen there in the next 10 years. So storage through batteries is one thing. Demand management and the smart grid is another way that we can handle this. Tidal lagoons give us controllable renewable energy. Geothermal is renewable energy that's on 24/7. It's the much fabled baseload. On a graph, that's a straight horizontal line, which fossil fuel believers almost fetishize about. And we're involved in the first project in Britain to do that, to make electricity from heat deep underground. It's a fantastic opportunity. The byproduct of that is lithium, which we can use to make batteries. Lithium being mined here in Britain. as a byproduct of making clean electricity. I think that's fantastic. Other people are toying with the idea of gravity batteries, using old mine shafts and pulling up big weights at times of excess electricity with an electric winch, and then releasing it through a generator at times of low electricity production. I don't know if the economics are good for that, but it's an interesting idea. And then you come down to the home scale, and for many years we've looked at the way energy is used in our country, and we have at the moment a kind of basically dumb demand system. We all use energy at the same time, and so if you look at graphs of consumption, it peaks at lunchtime, and then it peaks in the evening, particularly Monday to Friday in the winter when we get the biggest peaks. And so our system at the moment is scaled to deal with these big peaks, and as a result it's got a 50% load factor, which means year round we're only using half the capacity of our grid and of our power stations, which is terribly wasteful. So a small scale battery at a home could be used to reduce the peak demand of each home and therefore the peak demand of all homes and the actual peaks on the grid. And it could be an enormous efficiency boosting measure. So we've been trying to develop a device for that for a number of years. We've been sidetracked by all kinds of problems and things, but we have to get back to it in the next year or two. But meanwhile, other people are building battery storage devices for homes to absorb the solar power that people are making, so they don't dump it into the grid where they don't get paid for it very much at all. That makes sense, but our idea is different to that. It's making households a dynamic part of the smart grid.
Good. Well, I think I'll just end the questions here by going back to the political side of things. You talk of an energy review. What is happening there in the, shall we say, medium term, short to medium term? Who is advising government? Is there anyone they actually listen to? And with different governments potentially every 4 or 5 years, are we going to ever have stability in this sense?
Right now, we've got a prime minister that can't tell if he's in a party or a work meeting. I don't think we have much hope of getting a serious energy review. Not until this prime minister goes, either because he gets deposed by his own party or because we have a general election. But we do badly need a review of energy policy, and we do need to have a proper one. I just don't think we're going to get one under current circumstances.
Okay, Tim, back to you. Is there anything you'd like to conclude yourself with?
No, well, that's gone into a lot of interesting areas that I hadn't thought about. Very interesting. I was slightly intrigued by the comment about photosynthesis, which came from, I think, John Ward, which I presume is a reference to the idea that the increased levels of carbon dioxide are increasing the photosynthesis. Was that John's point?
I think it is.
Yeah,
I think it is, and it's a good point. Plants are the most effective way to absorb carbon. Rewilding Britain is an incredible opportunity, and if we've got a couple of minutes, I just want to say this: our work is focused on energy, transport, and food because it's 80% of everybody's personal carbon footprint, and the issues are intertwined. If we all went plant-based instead of eating meat, we'd free up 75% of farmland, which is 50% of our entire country. If we rewild that, we can absorb way more carbon than we need to get to zero carbon with all of the other measures that we do. So a vital piece of the puzzle is to change what we eat, as well as change how we travel and change how we power our homes: energy, transport, and food.
that sounds an excellent summation of your position, Dale.
Yeah, thank you.
I think I believe that David Austin is going to offer a vote of thanks. So, David, are you there? Are you on?
I am, and I've been here all the time. I would really like to thank you, Dale, for this opportunity you've given. I think it won't be just this society that benefits, because it's on a recording and people can tap into that. But we've benefited from your encyclopedic knowledge of energy and really all the sort of off the wall thinking as well, which is really so refreshing that to know that there's people out there and yourself thinking new ways of doing things and innovative approaches to this intractable problem. I don't think any of us envy your position at the moment with so much pressure on energy and so on, and we're so grateful for you for giving up the time to devote to these to the society and these questions, which have been really brilliantly answered and responded to. And I think we've all come away a lot wiser than we were. And so very many thanks, and really everything going for Ecotricity. We're all rooting for you. So all the very best and many thanks for this talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, David, Tim, everybody that's watching. I can't see you all, but thank you for listening. Thank you for the questions, and thanks for the opportunity to come and have a chat to you all.
Wonderful to have you.